Hello and welcome back to this series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are looking at the games in the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, and we are going through each of those games one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of those games. Now we are just starting to look at the games of a famous master, Tartakower, who in this game has the black pieces, and Reti offers a bit of an introduction to Tartakower. He states that he was born in 1887 and he became a promising player before World War One, but it was only after the war that he started to win several tournaments. And Reti comments that Tartakower was very successful in a lot of different professions. He wasn't just a chess master; he was an author, I believe he was also an actor as well. But his ability to succeed in these different professions is due to him having a very high work capacity. And Reti also comments that Tartakower doesn't always play the strongest openings. Instead, he sometimes plays openings which may have been thought dubious or not so strong, so we can almost illustrate the weaknesses of the theories other masters had in those openings. So one opening which Reti uses as an example is the Dutch attack and Dutch defense. Now the Dutch attack starts with f4, otherwise known as the bird's opening. However, Reti comments that this is obviously a bit of a weakening move, and it reveals White's plan from the get-go. White is going to have to try and develop this bishop somehow, and obviously developing on this diagonal isn't really going to be possible. So they're going to have to try and develop to g3, and it sort of reveals White's plan, and it's a bit of a weakening move. However, the other example is the Dutch defense, which after d4, f5. So it's the exact same sort of thing in reverse. Instead of f4 by White, we have f5 by Black. Now this is actually quite a bit more sound than the Dutch attack. And we see it quite a bit today. I know where Simon Williams, a Ginger GM, has done a couple of courses and things on this, and he plays it quite regularly. Now, Reti comments that the reason f5 is okay on Black's move rather than White's is because Black isn't necessarily trying to fight for an advantage. Black is a tempo down, so White has the opening advantage, and therefore Black has to aim to achieve equality, and therefore needs to try and play an opening which achieves equality. Once they've achieved equality, they can then continue to accumulate some more advantages and try and win the game that way. Of course, White will be doing the exact same thing. Now, the move f5 is quite similar to knight f6 in that they both try and control this e4 square. So White has pushed d4, and this means that the d-pawn is no longer able to defend the e4 square. So this is a weak square. And this f5 pawn push is controlling e4 is a key factor of the Dutch defense. Now, before we looked at the Dutch defense, Reti comments that it used to be considered that the Staunton gambit with e4 was almost the refutation of the Dutch defense. And he gives f takes e4, knight c3, knight f6, and bishop g5 as the continuation. And he says that currently White doesn't really threaten anything. Bishop takes f6 followed by knight takes e4 isn't really much of a threat. Black is a pawn up after all, and Black may choose to therefore give up this e4 pawn in order to get the advantage of having the bishop pair. So White would have to probably offer another gambit in terms of pushing f3, whether now or later on. And because of that, Black's able to get quite a good advantage. Reti gives Reti says that Tartakower's recommendation is g6. That after f3, he takes f3, knight takes f3, d5. And this is as far as Reti goes in this particular variation, but he says that black is completely fine here, and the computer would agree. Black's able to develop the bishop, is able to castle, he has the pawn in the centre. Black's doing quite well. The continuation which Reti advises is d6, hoping to try and gain control of the centre with e5, which may also make castling on the queen side possible, according to Reti. Oh. So, sorry about that. After d6, f3, he takes f3, knight takes f3, bishop g4. This is what Reti gives, and he says that black's position isn't really bad at all. He evaluates this as being fairly equal, really. However, he also says that after d4 you could start with e6 and then follow up with f5. So this e6 pawn, this e6 followed by f5 means that e4 sort of loses a lot of its sting. And he does sort of the downside of this e6 pawn push is that white could just play e4, and then you have to almost transpose into a French defense. The French defense is completely fine, of course, but it may not be within your repertoire. You have to know how to play it. So c4 and then f5. And now here Reti comments on the ideas of the Dutch defense. So black would usually play knight f6, controlling e4, b6, bishop b7, controlling e4, and potentially after knight c3 may also play bishop b4, pinning the knight to the king because the knight was attacking e4. So this e4 point here, it becomes very much a strong point for black. And I know in some variations in the classical Dutch with bishop e7, knight f6, you will also sometimes play knight e4 and be willing to trade off this knight and then push d5. So I'm just wasting a few moves, but this may be the sort of idea behind it. You wouldn't do it straight away, of course, but this is the idea where you have a very strong centre almost. That's sort of a more modern idea. But this e4 square is key for black. And another idea might be... Well, that's the most common one. If we look at white's options first then, white has two options to mainly counter this. Reti gives d4, c4, followed by e3, bishop d3 and knight c3, and potentially then knight e2 as well. And the idea is that let's just put all these on the board. So the idea is that white is able to push f3 if they so choose, because the knight isn't on f3, which gives them control over e4 and also allows them to potentially push e4 themselves. So that's one potential idea that white may have in terms of trying to get e4 in themselves. Because if white is able to push e4 and potentially even follow that up with d5, then black's entire idea of developing their pieces around this e4 square fails from the get-go. The other area which Reti comments is the other development system is one which Grunfeld gave, and this is to start with g3, aiming to fianchetto the bishop on g2. And of course, if black were to try and play d5, then c takes d5, e takes d5, and this pawn may be a bit weak later on. especially if d5, f5, g3. Now if black tries to play d5, trying to hamper this bishop, then the pawn can sort of be attacked quite easily and the bishop can come out. And there may be some weaknesses in white's position. Now in the game, we see e6, d4, c4, f5, and then we see knight to c3, again controlling this e4 square. Knight f6, and now we see a3. And Reti comments that this a3 move is quite characteristic of Maroczy's defensive style. So Maroczy's aiming to prevent bishop b4, which is in the theme of the opening almost. You know, white wants to try and control this e4 square, so white is stopping the bishop pinning the knight, which obviously this pin would add some control over the e4 square. However, this a3 move is very slow. Now Tartakower continues with bishop to e7. We have e3, castles, bishop to d3, and now d5. So black's aiming for the stonewall structure with pawns on f5, e5, f5, e6, d5, and c6. Now if we compare this to game number 32 that we looked at, which I've got open ready, which was Schlechter versus John, we see that white was able to develop their bishop, a dark square bishop outside of the pawn chain, onto f4. Whereas in this game, white hasn't been able to do that. The bishop is stuck behind the pawn on e3. And that's one of the key themes of this opening currently. And because of that, white has no real way to fight back against this stonewall formation. Therefore, Reti actually recommends that white almost forms a stonewall themselves with f4, knight f3, and then potentially a later knight e5. Or alternatively, they could try the sort of formation which white tried in a game, which is knight f3, knight f3, castles, and then knight e4. So knight f3, castles, and now knight e5, intending f4. It's basically the same sort of idea with trying to get their own little stonewall structure, but with a slightly different move order. So in the game, white played knight f3, intending for that sort of idea, and black followed up with c6. Now Reti says that knight e4 is a very frequent error that is played in a stonewall, and it's because after c takes d5, e takes d5, queen b3, this pawn is pinned to the king, which means there is almost a double attack on e4 and on d5. And because of this, black is forced to take on c3. So because of that, we see c6 in the game instead of knight to e4. White castles. We have knight to e4 now. Now queen to c2. Again, still trying to pile up on this e4 square. We have bishop to d6, b3, knight to d7, and then bishop to b2. And Reti is commenting that white's next aim is to try and improve this dark square bishop. He says that bishop b2 would be very logical if white could try and continue with something like knight to e5. However, he says that Maroczy tended to play very defensively, and therefore he wouldn't really try an energetic system like a knight to e5, which he says is probably better for black, better for white. He also commented that in these positions, Nimzowitsch would often recommend moves like a4, intending bishop to a3 to try and trade off this bad bishop. But in the game, we see bishop to b2. Still not a bad move. Rook to f6. Rook f to e1. And now rook to h6. So black is now threatening bishop takes h2 check. So if we just waste a move, bishop takes h2 check. And the knight can't take, because after queen to h4, white's going to be struggling quite a lot. There's going to be a lot of different threats here. So because of the threat of the bishop sacrifice on h2, white played g3, just defending against a threat. We then see queen f6, bringing in the queen to the attack. Bishop f1. And Reti comments that white's position is already quite difficult. So white played bishop f1, but he actually wanted to play something like knight to d2. But this doesn't work because there's a nice little knight sacrifice here on f2. After king takes f2, rook takes h2 check, king to g1, bishop takes g3, attacking the rook. Now if the rook tries to move, the continuation which Reti gives is queen to h4. And now it's mate in 5, which at best. So let's say white tries to fork. Well, then rook h1 is going to come, followed by queen h3 check. Or another move which a computer gives is knight to d2, knight to d1. But then after bishop f2 check, rook takes f2, rook to h1, we have the same little pattern. So because of that, knight to d2 just loses to knight takes f2. So white was forced to play bishop f1. And now we see g5. So quite a strong move, immediately trying to push these pawns forwards. We see rook a to d1, g4. And now we see knight takes e4. Again, if knight to d2, then we'd have again knight takes f2. After king takes, rook takes f2 check. The black king is going to be fairly stuck here. Note that you can't block with the bishop, because after bishop takes g3 check, king takes g3, queen to h4, the king's running out of squares. King to f4 is the only square available. And then g3 check, king f3, queen to g4 is mate. So it's already really quite tactical. So because knight to d2 fails to knight takes f2, white takes on e4 first, removing that chance of black taking on f2. We see f takes e4, and now knight to d2. Now here Reti comments that white's king is clearly not very safe. However, black isn't exactly very well developed on the queen side. And that sort of makes the next move quite shocking. It's rook takes h2. And Reti's comments that this sort of move had never really been seen before. And the idea is that black is simply sacrificing the rook to break apart white's king side. And there is no definitive combination as such. I mean, computers are able to find definitive combinations and things. The computer recommends rook takes h2, but the amount of analysis a human would need to prove it is correct is simply unmanageable. But the idea is that black is sacrificing the rook to open up the king, and he's able to sort of do this. Well, he sacrifices a rook, and then he starts developing these pieces and bringing them over to the king side. And he's able to do this because he knows that although white's pieces are active on the queen side, they are unable to really participate in the defense of the king on the king side. Now, Reti does argue that after knight f8, trying to just develop your pieces instead of sacrificing on h2, he argues that this isn't really as strong. It gives the continuation bishop to g2, knight g6, knight f1, bishop to d7, rook to e2, and rook f8, followed by b4. And Reti argues that white has managed to gain time, and that this isn't really that effective of a continuation. However, I haven't really analysed this position a huge amount, but just looking at it with the computer is finding a large number of potential tactics for black, and even if the tactics weren't there, it would still be quite clear that actually black is starting to coordinate their pieces again for quite a strong kingside attack. So I'm not too sure I agree with Reti here, although I may be biased because I've had the computer to help me. But we didn't see that. We see rook takes h2, which is the best move anyway. King takes h2, and then queen takes f2 check. King to h1. Now, Reti comments that bishop to g2 isn't that good a move because white needs the option of trying to push the rook to e2. Obviously, now rook to e2 just loses the rook. And if this knight were to try and move, it's going to be very difficult. White wants the option of trying to push rook to e2 to try and kick the queen away and to get the rook defending the second rank. So king h1 is played here. We then see knight to f6, and Reti comments that the pin on the knight here is really essential. If black were to try and take some extra material, take on g3, well then knight to b1 can come, and this is still better for black, but white's queen is able to come to the defense, and it's black who's going to have to play extremely accurately to try and defend this position. And if black makes any small errors, then black's down quite a significant amount of material. So black instead plays knight f6, keeping the pin in place. We then see rook to e2, and now queen takes g3 is played. So now knight to b1, hoping to free up the queen and doubling up on the second rank. Knight to h5, queen to d2, bishop d7, rook f2, queen to h4 check, king to g1, and now bishop to g3. And we see how black, although black is down a rook for a few pawns, black was able to just gradually maneuver their pieces to essentially get all of these pieces over to the white king side, despite being down all that material. And as soon as black is able to coordinate all of the pieces to attack the white king, then that material won't really matter, because white doesn't have the amount of material that white will have defending the king is significantly less than the amount of material that black has attacking the king. Now here, black played bishop to g3, which is basically forcing white to give up the exchange. If white played rook to g2, the continuation which Tartakower gave is rook to f8, and now queen to e2, rook f3, bishop c3, and then bishop to d6, threatening rook h3. So because of that, bishop to e1, attacking the queen, g3, defending, and now knight to d2, attacking the rook, but then queen to g4. And now white has no real way of defending against the threat of knight g7 to knight f5. And in fact, when I put this into the computer's best moves were moves like b4 and a4. In fact, a4 is chess.com's top move. It's at a low depth, but still the best move. Knight to g7, and then the computer wants bishop takes g3, but the next best move is a5. So I'll push a5 just to demonstrate what will happen. Knight to f5 is coming, and now this is where things start getting very difficult. Let's say c5, bishop b8, and now let's say a6. Let's say white's going to try and get some more counterplay. Well, then you see how all these pieces are now lined up against the black king, the white king. Sorry. So now something like h5 could come, followed by h4, h3, h2, and white hasn't really got anything they can do to counter this. White's lost. The other alternative to rook to g2 is rook to h2, giving up the exchange this way. And now Reti gives Tartakower's variation, which is fairly long. This is move 25, and the variation goes to move 39. And I'll show it quite quickly. It goes bishop takes h2, queen takes h2, queen to g5, bishop c1, g3, queen h1, king h8, bishop e2, knight f6, rook f1, rook to g8, rook f4, e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5, queen h4, rook to g6, bishop d2, d4, e takes d4, now queen takes d4, king to g2, queen to b2. And this is where Reti says that Tartakower was saying that white is winning. However, Reti comments that Tartakower overlooked the following little combination. Rook takes f6. Because after rook takes, queen takes, forking, queen is forced to take, and now bishop to c3, pinning the queen to the bishop, but the queen to the king. And after takes, white is now clearly winning. So that was what the entire variation after rook h2, and it doesn't really prove much in terms of the variation isn't that sound. However, as Reti does comment, it's a very long variation, so it's hard to prove just by that one variation that Tartakower's theory of winning back the exchange is incorrect. And indeed, the computer agrees with Reti's analysis here. So white gives up the exchange instead. White plays bishop to c3. We see bishop takes f2 check, queen takes f2, g3 coming, and now queen to g2, and now rook to f8. And black has now finished their development and is now threatening rook f2, followed by the queen coming up here. So let's play a move. So they're currently they're not threatening that. So they're currently threatening rook f2, followed by something like queen h1, and then rook to h2, winning the queen. So that's the current threat. So white plays bishop e1, defending the f2 square, and also hoping to try and give back a piece. So here white is hoping for something like queen takes h2 check, because after queen takes h2, g takes h2, king takes h2, rook takes f1. Piece-wise, things are equal. It's a bishop and knight and rook. However, black has a 2-pawn advantage. However, Reti comments that this is what white was hoping would be the outcome essentially after he played bishop e1. He's hoping to just sort of give back the piece. He'd be in a bit of a losing endgame, but he can still try and fight to hold it. However, after rook takes f1 check, then the game is pretty much lost. We see king takes f1, e5, and now king to g1. The other moves which Reti gives is bishop takes g3, but then after knight takes g3 check, king f2, bishop to g4, attacking the rook, rook e1, and then knight to e2 check, king f1, and now king h8, followed by bishop to h3 is one potential continuation, winning the queen. The alternative, instead of bishop takes g3, which Reti gives, is king to e2. However, after bishop to g4 check, king to d2, queen to h2, queen takes, pawn takes, this pawn's going to promote, and it's going to be very difficult to stop this pawn promoting. And this rook is also under a direct attack. So if the bishop tries to move, the rook gets taken. If the rook moves to here, then you just queen. So white avoids all that and plays king to g1 instead. But of course this doesn't quite work either, it's just a winning position for black. Bishop to g4 is played. Now bishop takes g3, hoping to give back a bit more material. Now if white had played rook to d2 trying to save the rook, then after e takes d4, bishop to f3, then white's still in trouble. Bishop takes g3, knight takes g3, queen h2. This is a combination which Reti gives. However, after knight to e2 check, followed by knight takes d4, Reti's arguing that black is able to quite easily salvage and win this endgame. They're very likely going to have two passed pawns in the centre of the board, and yes, they may be down in exchange, but with this passed pawn as well here, Reti is able to argue that this is just far more beneficial for black. So that was a variation after bishop takes g3. In the game, that was a variation. So we've just seen bishop to g4. That was a variation if white tries to save the rook by playing rook to d2. In the game, we see bishop takes g3. And now Tartakower finishes off the game with knight takes g3. That exposes the attack on the rook still. Rook to e1. Knight to f5. Now queen to f2, hoping to try and get a queen trade. Queen to g5. Let me see, d takes e5. And Reti comments that here it seems as if white has almost given up. He's not able to stop the attack. He takes the pawn. He isn't really defending that well anymore. And the next move is bishop f3 check, making a discover check on the king. King f1, knight to g3 check, and here white resigns. And the reason is after king g1, it's going to just be winning the queen. It's a discovered attack on the queen, and obviously the king can't take because the bishop defends h1. And the only other alternative to moving the king was to take on g3, which would just again lose the queen. So in this position, therefore, white resigns because at this point it is just lost. It's actually mate in 10 according to the computer with best play, which that's with queen takes g3. However, whether Maroczy saw that or not, I don't know, but he certainly would have seen that the queen would have been lost. And so that's the end of game 48. I believe we have a couple more Tartakower games. So if you like this video, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.